Picture this. You're standing in front of Buckingham Palace on what seems like an ordinary Tuesday morning. Tourists are snapping photos, children are pointing at the famous red uniforms, and everything feels perfectly normal. Then, in one shocking moment, a simple cup of coffee becomes the center of an international incident that will change multiple lives forever. What started as a moment of frustration turned into a story of unexpected friendship, cultural understanding, and the power of human connection that crossed all boundaries of tradition and protocol. This isn't just another tourist mishap. This is the remarkable true story of how one impulsive act led to consequences that shocked the world and taught us all something profound about forgiveness, duty, and what it really means to serve others. The person who threw that coffee had no idea they were about to become part of a story that would be talked about for decades. The guard who received it never imagined that this moment would transform not just his career, but his entire understanding of his role in the world. And the witnesses? They became part of something so extraordinary that it challenged everything they thought they knew about tradition, humanity, and second chances. Get ready for a journey that will take you from the marble steps of one of the world's most famous palaces to the quiet corners where real human connections are made, where protocol meets compassion, and where sometimes the most unexpected moments create the most beautiful outcomes. The morning sun cast long shadows across the forecourt of Buckingham Palace as tourists began their daily pilgrimage to witness the changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Sarah Martinez, a 34-year-old teacher from Phoenix, Arizona, clutching a steaming cup of coffee from a nearby cafe. She had saved for 3 years to make this trip to London, and today was supposed to be the highlight of her vacation. Sarah had arrived at the palace gates at 7:30 a.m., determined to get the perfect spot for photos. She was documenting every moment of her journey for her students back home, who had been following her adventure through daily video updates. The coffee in her hands was her third cup of the morning. Jet lag had been brutal, and she was running on determination and caffeine. Standing motionless in his scarlet tunic and bearskin hat was Guardsman James Wellington, 26, who had been serving with the Grenadier Guards for 4 years. To the thousands of tourists who photographed him daily, he was simply part of the scenery, a living statue representing centuries of British tradition. But behind that stoic exterior was a young man dealing with his own struggles. His father had recently been diagnosed with cancer, his girlfriend had ended their relationship the week before, and he had been working extra shifts to help with his family's medical expenses. James had learned to find peace in the stillness required by his duty. The meditation-like state of standing guard had become his refuge from the chaos of personal problems. He focused on his breathing, on the weight of his rifle, on the familiar sounds of London traffic mixing with tourist chatter. Today felt different, though. There was tension in the air that he couldn't quite identify. Sarah positioned herself about 10 feet from James, adjusting her phone to get the perfect angle. She wanted to capture not just the guard, but the entire scene, the palace behind him, the ornate gates, the other tourists in their excited anticipation. She had promised her class of 5th graders that she would bring back something special, and this photo was going to be it. The first sign of trouble came when a large tour group pushed past Sarah, jostling her as they tried to get closer to the gate. Coffee sloshed in her cup, and she felt a moment of irritation. She had been standing there for nearly an hour, patiently waiting, and now these newcomers were trying to muscle in on her spot. "Excuse me," she said politely to one of the tour members, a man with a large camera who had stepped directly in front of her. He ignored her completely, adjusting his lens for a close-up shot of James. Sarah tried to move to the left, but found her path blocked by a family with 3 small children who were running around excitedly, pointing at the guard and shouting observations in what sounded like German. The parents seemed oblivious to the chaos their children were creating, too busy taking selfies with the palace in the background. The frustration was building, but Sarah reminded herself that she was on vacation, that this was supposed to be fun, that she shouldn't let inconsiderate tourists ruin her experience. She took a deep breath and tried to find another angle for her photo. Meanwhile, James was aware of the growing crowd around him, but maintained his disciplined focus. He had learned early in his training that crowds could be unpredictable, that tourists sometimes did surprising things, and that his job was to remain professional regardless of what happened around him. He had stories from fellow guards, people trying to make him laugh, children attempting to touch his rifle, adults posing inappropriately for photos. The tour group leader, a woman with a loud voice and a small flag, began explaining the significance of the uniform to her group. She gestured dramatically, speaking in broken English mixed with what Sarah assumed was Italian. The woman's voice carried over the general murmur of the crowd, and Sarah found herself unwillingly listening to a lecture she had already heard twice from other tour guides that morning. Sarah checked her phone. It was 9:15 a.m., and she had promised her students she would go live at 9:30 to show them the Guard and talk about British history. She needed to get her photos soon so she could prepare for the video call. The pressure was mounting, and the crowd seemed to be getting larger and more chaotic by the minute. A street performer had set up nearby, playing what sounded like a broken violin badly. The discordant music added to the sensory overload that was beginning to overwhelm Sarah. She was tired, caffeinated to the point of jitters, surrounded by pushing tourists, and increasingly frustrated by her inability to get the shots she needed for her students. James noticed the violinist too. The music was off-key and distracting, but he had learned to tune out such disturbances. What he couldn't ignore was the growing restlessness in the crowd. He could sense the energy shifting, becoming more agitated. Some tourists were becoming impatient, apparently expecting something more dramatic than a guard simply standing still. A group of teenagers had started a game of trying to get James to react, making faces at him and calling out jokes. James maintained his composure, but he could feel the situation becoming more challenging. This was the part of his duty that required the most mental discipline, dealing with people who saw him as entertainment rather than a professional soldier performing an important role. Sarah made one more attempt to move to a better position. She squeezed between two families, apologizing as she went, and finally found a small opening where she could get a clear shot of James. She raised her phone, trying to frame the perfect photo, when disaster struck. A child, probably no more than 8 years old, came running through the crowd playing some sort of chase game with his siblings. He was moving fast, not watching where he was going, completely caught up in the excitement of the moment. Sarah saw him coming but couldn't move out of the way quickly enough in the pressed crowd. The collision was inevitable. The child slammed into Sarah's side with surprising force, sending her stumbling forward. She tried to catch herself, tried to save the coffee, tried to avoid falling, but physics and momentum were working against her. The cup flew from her hand in a perfect arc, the hot liquid spreading out in a dark stream that seemed to move in slow motion. James saw it coming. In the split second before impact, his training kicked in, but there was nowhere to go, nothing he could do without abandoning his post. The coffee hit him squarely in the chest, soaking through his pristine red tunic, spreading down his white belt, and dripping onto his perfectly polished boots. The crowd went completely silent. Sarah stood frozen in horror, her hand still outstretched from where the cup had been. The child who had caused the collision had disappeared back into the crowd, probably unaware of what he had set in motion. Every phone and camera in the vicinity was now pointed at the scene, capturing what would soon become an international incident. James felt the hot coffee seeping through his uniform, but his training held. He did not move. He did not speak. He did not even change his facial expression. But, inside, a storm of emotions was brewing. Embarrassment, frustration, and a deep sadness that this moment would likely define his military career in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Sarah wanted to disappear into the ground. She wanted to run away, to pretend this hadn't happened, to wake up and discover it was all a nightmare brought on by too much caffeine and jet lag. But she couldn't move. She was trapped in the moment, surrounded by witnesses, facing the consequences of an accident that felt like the worst possible outcome of her dream vacation. The silence stretched on, heavy with anticipation and shock, as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The silence lasted exactly 14 seconds, though it felt like an eternity to everyone involved. Then, as if someone had suddenly turned the volume back up on the world, chaos erupted around the palace gates. Camera phones clicked and flashed as dozens of tourists captured the scene from every possible angle. Within moments, the first videos were already being uploaded to social media platforms, tagged with phrases like "tourist attacks Royal Guard" and "American coffee incident at Buckingham Palace." The modern world moved fast, and Sarah Martinez was about to discover just how quickly a single moment could spiral completely out of control. Sarah's first instinct was to help. She stepped forward, reaching into her purse for tissues, napkins, anything that could help clean up the mess she had caused. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she began. But before she could take another step, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Step back from the guard immediately." The command came from Sergeant Major Robert Hartwell, who had appeared as if from nowhere. A 20-year veteran with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, Hartwell had been watching the morning crowd from his position near the palace entrance when he saw the coffee fly through the air. Sarah froze mid-step, her tissues still clutched in her hand. "I was just trying to help. I said step back," Hartwell repeated, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military service. "You have interfered with the Queen's Guard in the performance of his duty. This is a serious matter." The crowd around them was growing larger by the minute. Word of the incident had spread quickly through the tourist groups, and people were pushing forward to get a better look. Street vendors had abandoned their posts to come see what was happening. Even the off-key violinist had stopped playing to join the gathering crowd. James Wellington continued to stand motionless, coffee still dripping from his uniform, his face maintaining the same stoic expression he had worn before the incident. But behind that professional mask, his mind was racing. He could feel the wetness spreading across his chest, the sticky residue beginning to dry on his skin, the weight of hundreds of stares focused on his humiliation. More concerning to James was what this meant for his career. Guards who became the center of public incidents rarely escaped without consequences. There would be reports to file, interviews to conduct, and likely disciplinary action to face. At best, he would be reassigned to duties away from the public eye. At worst, this could end his military service entirely. Sarah tried again to approach, her teacher instincts driving her to fix what she had broken. "Please, I can pay for cleaning." "I can, ma'am. You need to move away from the guard," interrupted a police constable who had materialized beside Sergeant Major Hartwell. PC Amanda Foster had been patrolling the area when she heard the commotion. She could see the situation escalating and knew that crowd control would be essential to prevent things from getting worse. "But it was an accident," Sarah protested, her voice rising with desperation. "A child ran into me. I didn't mean for this to happen. I would never deliberately." "That's what they all say," muttered someone in the crowd, loud enough for Sarah to hear. She spun around, trying to identify the speaker, but found herself facing a sea of faces ranging from amused to hostile. Some people were clearly enjoying the drama, while others looked at her with obvious disapproval. "American tourists," she heard another voice say dismissively. "No respect for tradition." The comment stung worse than Sarah had expected. She had come to London with such excitement, such respect for the history and culture she was experiencing. She had spent months reading about British customs, studying the proper etiquette for visiting royal sites, and preparing educational materials for her students. To be painted as an ugly American tourist was devastating. Meanwhile, the social media storm was already building momentum thousands of miles away. The first video of the incident had been posted by a teenager from Manchester who happened to be visiting London with his family. Within 30 minutes, it had been shared over 2,000 times, with comments ranging from outraged, disgraceful behavior, to amused, bet that woke him up, to conspiracy-minded, staged for attention. News outlets were beginning to pick up the story. The Daily Mail's online team had already crafted a headline. "Shocking moment: American tourist hurls coffee at Queen's Guard at Buckingham Palace." The article was thin on facts but heavy on speculation, describing Sarah as an unidentified American woman who had deliberately targeted the guard in an unprovoked attack. Back at the palace gates, Sergeant Major Hartwell was trying to assess the situation. He had dealt with similar incidents before, though none quite this public. The key was to restore order quickly while ensuring that proper protocols were followed. He couldn't simply ignore what had happened, but he also needed to be mindful of the international implications of how they handled an obvious tourist mistake. "Guardsman Wellington," Hartwell said quietly, approaching James with careful steps. "Can you continue your duty?" James's response was barely audible. "Yes, Sergeant Major." "Do you require medical attention?" "No, Sergeant Major." Hartwell nodded, then turned to assess the crowd situation. The circle of onlookers had grown to include at least 100 people, with more arriving every minute. Tourist guides were pointing out the scene to their groups, explaining in multiple languages what was happening. The situation was becoming a tourist attraction in its own right. PC Foster was dealing with the more aggressive members of the crowd, people who were pushing forward trying to get better photos or demanding answers about what would happen to the coffee thrower. She had called for backup, knowing that crowd control could become a serious issue if emotions continued to escalate. Sarah felt completely isolated in the center of the chaos. Every face around her seemed hostile or curious, but none showed the sympathy she desperately hoped to find. She was beginning to understand that this wasn't just an embarrassing travel story she would laugh about later. This was becoming something much bigger and more serious than she had ever imagined. Her phone buzzed with notifications. Friends and family back in Phoenix were seeing the videos online and reaching out with concern and confusion. Her school principal had sent a text asking if she was the teacher in the viral video. Her students were messaging through the classroom app, asking if she was in trouble and whether she was coming home. The weight of the situation was beginning to crush down on her. This was supposed to be her dream vacation, the adventure she had saved and planned for years. Instead, she was standing in the middle of an international incident, being photographed and filmed by hundreds of strangers, while the man she had accidentally wronged continued to suffer in silent dignity just a few feet away. James could hear fragments of the conversations around him, the speculation about what would happen next, the debates about whether tourists should be allowed so close to the guards. He wanted to tell them that Sarah was clearly devastated by what had happened, that it was obviously an accident, that she didn't deserve the hatred being directed at her. But his training, his duty, and his uniform all demanded silence. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, supposed to be a symbol of British stoicism and dignity, standing in a coffee-stained uniform while chaos swirled around him. The very traditions he was meant to represent were being tested by this moment, and he wasn't sure whether he was upholding them or being destroyed by them. As the crowd continued to grow and the situation showed no signs of calming down, both Sarah and James were beginning to realize that their lives had just changed forever. The question was whether that change would destroy them both, or if somehow something positive could emerge from this disaster. Neither of them could have predicted what would happen next, or how this moment of apparent failure would eventually become something beautiful and meaningful that would touch lives around the world. What happened next defied every expectation and protocol that had governed such situations for centuries. As the crowd pressed closer and the tension reached a breaking point, Guardsman James Wellington did something that no one saw coming, something that would change not only his own life, but the lives of everyone witnessing this moment. He winked. It was the smallest possible gesture, lasting barely a fraction of a second, and it was directed solely at Sarah Martinez. In that tiny movement of his left eyelid, James broke the first rule of being a Queen's Guard, and in doing so, he created a crack in the wall of protocol that would eventually bring the whole thing crashing down in the most beautiful way possible. Sarah caught the wink and felt her world shift. This man, who should have been furious with her, who had every right to demand her arrest, who was suffering public humiliation because of her clumsiness, had just shown her a moment of pure human kindness. The gesture was so unexpected, so completely contrary to everything she thought she knew about royal guards, that she almost thought she had imagined it. But she hadn't imagined it. And that tiny act of rebellion against protocol gave her the courage to do something equally unexpected. Instead of continuing to apologize or trying to flee the scene, Sarah Martinez, fifth-grade teacher from Phoenix, Arizona, did something that would be remembered long after the coffee stains had been cleaned away. She began to sing. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, almost under her breath. The song was "You Are My Sunshine," the same simple melody she sang to her students when they were upset or scared. She had no idea why she chose that particular song, or even why she was singing at all. It just seemed like the right thing to do in a moment when nothing else felt right. The effect was immediate and profound. The crowd's aggressive energy began to shift as people strained to hear what she was singing. The clicking of phone cameras slowed as people focused on listening rather than documenting. Even Sergeant Major Hartwell, who had been prepared to escalate the situation to its official conclusion, found himself pausing to process this unexpected development. James heard the singing and felt something inside his chest loosen. The melody was simple and sweet, completely out of place in this setting of military formality and tourist chaos. It reminded him of his childhood, of his mother singing him to sleep when he was worried about the monsters under his bed. The memory hit him with surprising force, and for a moment, he forgot where he was and what he was supposed to be doing. Sarah continued singing, her voice growing slightly stronger as she realized that somehow, impossibly, it was working. The hostile energy in the crowd was dissipating, replaced by something softer and more curious. People were no longer pushing forward aggressively. Instead, they were listening, trying to understand what was happening. "You make me happy when skies are gray," she sang softly, looking directly at James. "You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away." It was then that James Wellington made the second decision that would define not only this moment, but the rest of his life. Still maintaining his position, still holding his rifle correctly, still wearing his coffee-stained uniform with dignity, he began to hum along. The sound was so quiet that only those closest to him could hear it. But it was unmistakably there, a low, melodic humming that perfectly matched Sarah's singing. The crowd nearest to James fell completely silent, straining to catch every note of this unprecedented moment. Sergeant Major Hartwell felt his carefully constructed professional world tilting on its axis. In 20 years of military service, he had never encountered anything like this situation. Every protocol demanded that he stop this breach of conduct immediately, that he remove James from his post, and arrest the tourist for interfering with a guard's duties. But something about the scene in front of him made him hesitate. The crowd had transformed from an angry mob into something resembling a congregation. People who had been shouting and pushing just minutes before were now standing quietly, many with tears in their eyes as they witnessed this moment of unexpected grace. Children who had been running around chaotically were now standing still beside their parents, instinctively understanding that something important was happening. PC Foster found herself in an equally unprecedented situation. The disturbance she had been called to control had essentially controlled itself. The crowd was larger than ever, but it was no longer disruptive. Instead, hundreds of people were gathered in respectful silence around two individuals who were creating something beautiful out of what should have been a disaster. Sarah finished the song, and the silence that followed was different from the shocked silence that had greeted the coffee incident. This was a reverent quiet, the kind that follows a prayer or a moment of profound shared experience. For several seconds, no one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. Then, from somewhere in the back of the crowd, someone began to clap. It started slowly, just one person, then 2, then 10. Within moments, the entire crowd was applauding, not mockingly or sarcastically, but with genuine appreciation for what they had just witnessed. James felt the applause wash over him like a warm wave. He had spent 4 years learning to ignore the crowds, to treat the tourists as background noise while he performed his duty. But this felt different. This felt like recognition, not of his uniform or his role, but of him as a human being who had just participated in something beautiful. Sarah was crying now, but they were tears of relief rather than embarrassment. The hostility that had surrounded her just minutes before had been replaced by something she could only describe as love. Strangers were smiling at her, nodding approvingly, and she could see phones being put away as people chose to experience the moment rather than document it. The applause gradually faded, but the transformed atmosphere remained. Conversations began to restart around the crowd, but they were different now, quieter, more thoughtful. People were talking about what they had just seen, trying to make sense of how a moment of conflict had become a moment of connection. Sergeant Major Hartwell approached James slowly, his mind racing through the implications of what had just occurred. By every measure of military law and royal protocol, James had committed a serious breach of conduct. He had broken character, engaged with a civilian, and participated in a public spectacle while on duty. The punishment should be swift and severe. But Hartwell was also a human being who had just witnessed something extraordinary. In 30 seconds of quiet humming, James had defused a situation that could have escalated into an international incident. He had turned a moment of embarrassment into a moment of grace, and he had done it while maintaining his position and his dignity. Guardsman Wellington, Hartwell said quietly, stopping just close enough to James to be heard without alerting the crowd. Yes, Sergeant Major. That was... Hartwell paused, searching for the right words. That was not regulation. No, Sergeant Major. It was also... Another pause. It was also the right thing to do. The admission surprised them both. Hartwell had never before suggested that anything other than strict adherence to protocol could be the right thing to do. But something about this situation had shown him that sometimes humanity mattered more than regulations. Meanwhile, Sarah was being approached by members of the crowd who wanted to thank her for creating such a beautiful moment. An elderly British woman took her hands and said, "Dear, that was the most lovely thing I've ever seen at the palace." A young father with 2 small children told her, "My kids will remember this forever. You've given them something special." The teenager who had first posted the video online was now filming again, but this time his commentary was completely different. "This is incredible," he was saying into his phone. "What started as an accident has turned into something amazing. I've never seen anything like this at Buckingham Palace." As word of the singing spread through the crowd and began to reach the online world, the narrative around the incident started to shift dramatically. The headlines were changing from "Tourist Attacks Royal Guard" to "Beautiful Moment at Palace as Tourist" and "Guard Create Magic Together." The story was no longer about American rudeness or British rigidity. It was about human connection transcending cultural and institutional boundaries. But the most important change was happening in the hearts of the two people at the center of it all. Sarah had discovered that even in her worst moments, kindness was possible. James had learned that sometimes the greatest act of service was not perfect adherence to duty, but perfect attention to humanity. Neither of them knew it yet, but their lives were about to become intertwined in ways that would surprise them both and inspire people around the world. The video of Sarah singing and James humming went viral within 6 hours. By evening, it had been viewed over 2 million times across various social media platforms, shared by celebrities, news outlets, and ordinary people who found themselves deeply moved by what they had witnessed. But the real story wasn't happening online. It was unfolding in the lives of the people who had created that moment. James Wellington finished his shift that afternoon knowing his military career hung in the balance. As he walked back to the guardroom, still wearing his coffee-stained uniform, he expected to face immediate disciplinary action. Instead, he found something he had never seen before in his 4 years of service: uncertainty among his superiors about how to handle an unprecedented situation. Colonel Patricia Thornberry, commanding officer of the 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards, had been dealing with phone calls all afternoon. The Palace Press Office wanted guidance on how to respond to media inquiries. Military headquarters was asking for a full report on the breach of protocol. But, most unexpectedly, she had received a personal call from someone she had never spoken to directly, a representative from the royal family's private office. The message had been brief but clear. Their Royal Highnesses had seen the video and found it rather touching. While protocol remained important, there was appreciation for the Guards' exemplary demonstration of British grace under pressure. The subtext was unmistakable. This was not to be treated as a typical disciplinary matter. Colonel Thornberry had spent 25 years in military service and had never faced a situation quite like this one. James had technically violated several regulations, but he had also demonstrated exactly the kind of character and judgment that the military hoped to instill in its finest soldiers. More importantly, he had somehow turned a potential public relations disaster into what was being called the most beautiful moment at Buckingham Palace in decades. Meanwhile, Sarah Martinez was experiencing her own whirlwind. She had returned to her hotel expecting to hide from the world for the remainder of her London stay, but found herself fielding calls from news organizations, talk shows, and documentary filmmakers. The incident that had mortified her that morning was being described as a perfect example of how human connection can transcend cultural barriers. Her students back in Phoenix had seen the videos and were beside themselves with excitement. Through video calls and messages, they told her she was famous and the coolest teacher ever. Their enthusiasm helped Sarah begin to see the incident through different eyes. What had felt like her worst nightmare was becoming something that might actually make a positive difference in people's lives. The transformation in public perception was remarkable. The initial comments on social media had been harsh and judgmental, but as the fuller story emerged and more videos from different angles were posted, the narrative shifted completely. People began sharing their own stories of moments when strangers had shown them unexpected kindness. The hashtag Sunshine at the Palace began trending worldwide. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, a professor of social psychology at Oxford University, was among the first academics to comment on the phenomenon. What we're seeing here is a perfect example of how authentic human moments can cut through all the noise and cynicism of modern life, she explained to the BBC. Two people from completely different worlds found a way to connect in a moment of crisis, and that connection is resonating with millions of people who are hungry for genuine human interaction. But the most significant development was happening quietly, away from the media attention. James had been granted permission to meet with Sarah the following morning, ostensibly for the purposes of completing an incident report, but really because Colonel Thornberry was curious to see what would happen when these two people talked face to face. They met in a small conference room at Wellington Barracks, with Sergeant Major Hartwell present as an observer. Sarah arrived nervous and apologetic, carrying a shopping bag that contained what appeared to be a new military dress uniform in James's size. James came in civilian clothes, jeans, and a sweater that made him look much younger than he had in his guard uniform. "I wanted to replace what I ruined," Sarah said immediately, gesturing to the bag. I know it can't fix what happened, but I thought, you don't need to do that, James interrupted gently. It was an accident. These things happen. It was the first time they had spoken directly to each other, and both were surprised by how normal the conversation felt. James's voice was soft with a slight Yorkshire accent that made him sound nothing like the imposing figure Sarah had imagined. Sarah's nervousness was endearing rather than annoying, and James found himself wanting to put her at ease. I've been thinking about yesterday, James continued. About what you did when everything went wrong. That song, where did that come from? Sarah smiled for the first time since the incident. I teach 5th grade. When my kids are upset or scared, sometimes singing helps them calm down. I guess I just defaulted to teacher mode. Well, it worked, James said. I was pretty upset myself, and it helped me too. As they talked, something remarkable began to happen. The formal purpose of their meeting, completing paperwork and assessing potential charges, faded into the background as two people discovered they genuinely liked each other. Sarah learned that James had joined the military after studying history at university, drawn by the same love of tradition and service that had brought her to London. James discovered that Sarah's passion for education came from her own struggles as a child, and her determination to help other kids who felt lost or misunderstood. Sergeant Major Hartwell, who had intended to keep the meeting brief and official, found himself listening to a conversation that was teaching him things about leadership he had never considered. These two people were problem-solving together, finding ways to turn a negative situation into something positive, and they were doing it naturally, without any formal training or protocol to guide them. I've been thinking, Sarah said after they had been talking for nearly an hour. My students have been following my London trip online. They saw what happened yesterday, and they're actually proud of how I handled it. But I think there's an opportunity here to turn this into a real learning experience. What do you mean? James asked. What if we could arrange for them to video chat with you? You could tell them about your job, about British history, about what it means to serve something bigger than yourself. They're at an age where they're starting to think about their futures, and meeting someone like you could really impact their thinking. James felt something light up inside his chest. Since joining the military, he had often wondered if his service made a real difference in people's lives. The idea of talking to American school children about duty, honor, and service appealed to him in ways he hadn't expected. I would love that, he said. But I want to be honest with them about what happened. About how sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules. That might be the most important lesson of all, Sarah agreed. What they were planning was unprecedented. A serving member of the Queen's Guard, conducting an international educational video call to discuss duty and humanity with American elementary students, all as a result of a coffee-throwing incident that had violated every protocol in the book. But somehow, it felt exactly right. Colonel Thornberry, who had been briefed on the conversation, made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of disciplining James for his breach of conduct, she was going to recommend him for a commendation for exceptional service under difficult circumstances. More than that, she was going to support his participation in Sarah's educational project. Sometimes, she explained to her staff later, real leadership means recognizing when the rule book doesn't have answers for the situations we face. What Guardsman Wellington did yesterday showed more wisdom and judgment than years of perfect protocol adherence. If we punish that kind of thinking, we'll never have soldiers capable of handling the unexpected challenges of the future. The decision set a precedent that would influence military policy for years to come, but its immediate effect was to transform two lives that had collided by accident into a partnership that would inspire people around the world. As Sarah prepared to extend her London stay and James arranged for leave time to work on their project, both were beginning to understand that what had started as the worst moment of their respective trips was becoming the beginning of something extraordinary. The coffee stain on James's uniform had been cleaned away within hours, but the connection forged in that moment of crisis would last a lifetime. 6 months after the coffee incident that changed their lives, Sarah Martinez and James Wellington were sitting in a London cafe, planning their third international video conference with students from around the world. What had started as a simple conversation between a teacher and a guard had evolved into something neither of them could have imagined, a global educational initiative that was transforming how young people thought about service, tradition, and human connection. The video call with Sarah's 5th grade class in Phoenix had been just the beginning. Word of their unique partnership had spread through educational networks, and soon they were receiving requests from schools in Australia, Canada, Japan, and dozens of other countries. Teachers wanted their students to hear the story directly from the people who had lived it, to understand how a moment of crisis had become a moment of grace. Sarah had taken a leave of absence from her teaching position to focus on what they were calling the Sunshine Project, named after the song that had transformed their first encounter. She was now based in London, working with educational consultants and child psychologists to develop curriculum materials that helped young people understand the importance of empathy, forgiveness, and finding human connections across cultural boundaries. James had been promoted to corporal and given a special assignment that allowed him to split his time between traditional guard duties and educational outreach work. The military had recognized that his natural ability to connect with young people was a valuable asset, and they were using his story to help recruit young men and women who were interested in service that went beyond traditional military roles. Their partnership had also caught the attention of the royal family. They had been invited to participate in a special ceremony at Buckingham Palace, where they were recognized for their contribution to international goodwill and youth education. The irony was not lost on either of them. They were being honored at the very place where their story had begun with such chaos and embarrassment. But the most meaningful impact of their work was happening in classrooms around the world. Teachers were reporting that their students were more interested in discussing conflict resolution, cultural differences, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. The simple story of a coffee spill that led to a song had become a powerful tool for teaching empathy and human understanding. "We got another request today," Sarah said, scrolling through emails on her laptop. "A school in rural Kenya. The teacher saw our video online and wants her students to participate in a call next month." "That's amazing," James replied, shaking his head in wonder. "Sometimes I still can't believe all of this came from what I thought was going to be the worst day of my military career." "I've been thinking about that," Sarah said, "about how we both assumed the worst possible outcome was happening, when actually something beautiful was beginning. I wonder how many other moments in our lives we've misunderstood that way." It was a profound observation that had become central to their educational message. They talked to students about the importance of pausing before judging situations, of looking for opportunities to respond with kindness rather than anger, and of recognizing that mistakes and accidents could become doorways to unexpected connections. Their relationship had evolved too. What had started as a formal apology had become a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared purpose. James had visited Phoenix during his leave, meeting Sarah's students in person and experiencing American culture through her eyes. Sarah had spent holidays with James's family in Yorkshire, learning about British traditions and the military family life that had shaped his values. "I have news," James said, pulling a letter from his jacket pocket. "I heard back from the university program. I've been accepted." Sarah looked up from her laptop, excited. "The education degree?" "Yes. I can complete it while continuing my military service, and when I'm finished, I'll be qualified to teach history and social studies. I'm thinking about specializing in international relations and cultural understanding." It was a natural evolution of what they had discovered together. James had found that his passion lay not just in serving his country through military duty, but in helping young people understand the importance of service, tradition, and human connection across cultural boundaries. The coffee incident had revealed talents he hadn't known he possessed, and had opened doors he never could have imagined. Sarah had been transformed by the experience as well. Her work with the Sunshine Project had taught her that education could extend far beyond the walls of a single classroom. She was learning to think globally while acting locally, to use technology to build bridges between cultures, and to find ways to make history and social studies relevant to young people who would inherit an increasingly connected world. Their story had also inspired others to look for moments of grace in difficult situations. They regularly received emails from people around the world who had been moved to act with unexpected kindness because of something they had learned from the palace video. A businessman in Tokyo had helped a lost tourist find her way home. A teenager in Sao Paulo had defended a classmate who was being bullied. A grandmother in Stockholm had reached out to refugees in her community. "There's something else," James said, his expression becoming more serious. "Colonel Thornberry called this morning. The military wants to formalize the Sunshine Project as an official international goodwill program. They're offering funding, logistical support, and the opportunity to expand into universities and adult education programs." Sarah felt her heart racing with excitement and terror in equal measure. "That's incredible and overwhelming. I know. It would mean traveling constantly, setting up programs in different countries, working with government officials, and educational administrators. It's much bigger than anything we've done so far. They sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the magnitude of what they were being offered. Their small project had grown organically, maintained its personal touch, and stayed true to the simple human connection that had started it all. Scaling it up to an official international level would bring opportunities they had never dreamed of, but it would also bring challenges and complexities they couldn't predict. "What do you think?" Sarah asked. "I think," James said slowly, "that 6 months ago, I would never have imagined that spilling coffee on a Queen's Guard could lead to an opportunity to change how young people around the world think about service and citizenship. If we've learned anything, it's that we shouldn't be too quick to assume we know where a story is going. So we say yes. We say yes, but we do it our way. We keep the focus on individual human connections. We remember that this all started because two strangers chose to respond to a crisis with kindness instead of anger. And we make sure that no matter how big this gets, it never loses the spirit of that moment when you sang, 'You are my sunshine' to a coffee-covered guard who was trying not to cry." As they shook hands on their decision, both of them thought back to that morning at Buckingham Palace when everything had gone wrong. Sarah remembered the terror she had felt as the coffee flew through the air, the certainty that she had ruined her vacation and humiliated herself in front of hundreds of strangers. James remembered the mortification of standing in his stained uniform, wondering if his military career was over before it had really begun. Neither of them could have predicted that those feelings of failure and embarrassment would become the foundation for work that would touch lives around the world. The lesson they had learned, and that they now taught to students everywhere, was simple but profound. Our worst moments can become our greatest opportunities if we choose to respond with grace instead of despair. 5 years later, the Sunshine Project had reached over 1 million students in 43 countries. Sarah had earned a doctorate in international education and was advising governments on cultural exchange programs. James had completed his education degree and was serving as a military liaison for youth development programs throughout the Commonwealth. But they still returned to Buckingham Palace every year on the anniversary of their first meeting, standing in the same spot where chaos had given way to connection. Tourists sometimes recognized them and asked for photos, but they always politely declined, preferring to stand quietly and remember the moment when a flying cup of coffee had taught them that the most important lessons often come disguised as disasters. The coffee stain had been cleaned away within hours, but the ripples from that moment continued to spread, touching lives and changing hearts in ways that would last forever. It was, as Sarah often told her students, proof that there is no such thing as an ordinary moment, only moments we haven't yet learned to see as extraordinary. And every time she told that story, somewhere in the audience, someone was inspired to look for the sunshine hidden in their own unexpected moments, ready to turn their next disaster into their greatest opportunity for grace.